there were many libertarian thinkers before anarchism developed, and we can see, particularly within the Western tradition, with the Greeks, that they were the first to start thinking for themselves and questioning religion and or a myth, and although they believed they practiced their own religion and they had their own myths, but they particularly thought one should examine and inquire into inherited beliefs. As Socrates famously said, an unexamined life is not worth living. And that although Plato in particular had developed a very hierarchical, authoritarian republic of the philosopher kings, there were other thinkers who totally rejected that approach. In particular, the Cynics and the Stoics, who made a distinction between man-made customs and rules, and nature, and they believed we had a reason to enable us to live according to nature and not according to inherited customs. And so they argued that we should live in a society without kings, without rulers, that sharing our property, and they eat that amongst the Stoics, Zeno of Citium argued was really probably the first internationalist, because he developed a sort of cosmopolitan approach when talking about universal brotherhood, which at the time was quite revolutionary beyond the idea of identifying with your own particular nations, your own particular city-state. Greeks were at war with each other, all the city-states, virtually perpetual war. Peace was an exception. They also had their societies based on slavery, and the women were were kept very much at home. But nevertheless, they did have some early anarchistic ideas. And also, of course, in Athens they had the first great experiment of direct democracy, where over 6,000 people would engage in deciding how to move forward in their city-state. And they also had the administration was done through 500 men. They all free citizens, as I said, based on slavery, nevertheless. But it does show that the first great participatory direct democracy, it is possible on a large scale, and even more in a larger society like ourselves, where things are decentralized power. That is also possible. So the Greeks did. And I love a story which is linked to Diogenes, who was a so-called Cynics. The Cynics said they were dog-like. Cygnus means dog, but because they argued they want to live according to nature and satisfy their desires in a natural way. And you don't need possessions. He allegedly lived in a tub, and just walked into the. He was joking with his society. He walked in the marketplace where the philosophers gathered for those who wanted to discuss things. So they had a freedom of assembly and freedom of expression and thought, looking for an honest man with a lantern at midday. Difficult to find. But he apparently, Alexander the Great, who had formed all the conquests, heard about him and thought he was the most powerful man in the world, and he could seduce Diogenes. So he went with his retinue one day to see him, and Diogenes was just leaning against a wall in the sun, and Alexander came to him and said, I'm clearly the most powerful man and wealthy in the world. I can give you anything. What do you want? And Diogenes replied, there's only one thing, Alexander, you can do, is to move away from the sun. And so at that moment, I think in many ways he was saying that the natural world is more powerful than you. I think also the sun shines on everybody equally, and is making a very profound point. So you had these are anarchistic guys. You know, they're early libertarians, and I think to have a very narrow, rigid, sectarian definition of anarchism dismisses a very rich body of experience and thinking, which we can certainly inspire us and learn from. If you look up through, I've talked about, there's obviously the Christian tradition has had this more libertarian strand, whether it's St. Aquinas saying love and do what you will, or the ranters and the diggers and the millenarian anarchists of the Middle Ages who wanted to create here and now the kingdom of God on earth, and without church and state, without kings as well. It is a state of fulfillment. But in the Renaissance, you having people like Rabelais saying, "Do what you will," and then you had a little bit later on in the 17th century, Etienne de la Boétie discussing how people do become voluntary slaves, voluntary servitude. And in the 17th century, you got the beginning of theory, I think, which we can look back to in Locke, who talked about they wanted to try and work out why to justify government. These earlier thinkers, Hobbes, of course, thinking that the natural state was war of all against all. Therefore, you had to have the sword and a very, very strong leviathan of a state to control people's wayward drives. But Locke, I think, had a much more accurate view of human beings, where he said that in the state of nature, although this is a hypothetical condition, of course, but in a state pre-government, is that people lived in perfect freedom without a common superior. But for him, there was a certain inconvenience about it. So he felt we needed a fairly minimal state to protect the rights of life and liberty, and of course property being the most important. Then he went on to even claim that you could, if your servant dug some turf, then it was your property. But that's slightly different. In the American Revolution, that comes through in some of the founders like Jefferson, who argued the best government governs least, and we can see with Thomas Paine, who wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, that where he declares that society in every state is a blessing, something which I agree with, and that government, even in its best state, is a necessary evil. So William Godwin, at the time of the French Revolution, who knew Paine a little, he started off in his great work, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, and I see Godwin as the father of theoretical, philosophical anarchism. He started off in a similar position to Paine, that maybe we do need a minimum government. But he realized, being a very imaginative thinker, that the more he thought about it, the more he realized that government wasn't a necessary evil, but it was a superfluous one. In fact, where the state jugglers, as he called them, but where the defenders of government and the state argued that we need a state to protect justice and peace, he felt that, and he felt it only aggravated and perpetuated injustice and inequality. So he looked forward to that period when the brute engine of government would be dissolved and people could live in a decentralized society. So this comes right through. This is part of now the sort of theoretical aspect of anarchism. I talked about that anarchist sensibility, which is age old, of those who want to be free and live with their companions in a voluntary way.